The encounter. The trading post was loud and chaotic, a place where different alien species came to trade, bargain, and sometimes fight. Zia, a young alien girl with soft purple skin and glowing green eyes, tried to stay invisible as she moved through the crowd. She pulled her hood lower, hiding her face. Her heart pounded in her chest. They were looking for her. She could feel it. The bounty hunters were near. Zia had seen their faces earlier, hard, cruel, and determined. They were after the crystal hidden in her bag, an ancient relic from her homeworld. She couldn't let them take it. It wasn't just valuable. It was sacred. She squeezed the bag close to her chest and quickened her pace. "Stop right there," a deep voice shouted behind her. Zia froze. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The crowd parted as 3 bounty hunters approached her. They were tall, muscular aliens with sharp features and weapons strapped to their belts. The leader, a scared alien with glowing red eyes, sneered at her. "You've run far enough, little girl. Hand over the crystal." Zia's hands trembled, but she didn't move. "I don't have it," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. The leader laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You think you can fool us? You're not getting away this time." Before Zia could react, the leader reached for her. She stumbled back, panic flooding her mind. But before his hand could grab her, another voice cut through the chaos. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The crowd turned to see who had spoken. A human man stepped forward, his gaze locked on the bounty hunters. He was tall, with sharp features and a calm, cold expression. His eyes were a piercing blue, and they seemed to see everything. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at them, like a predator sizing up its prey. The bounty hunters hesitated. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, and this one didn't look like an ordinary traveler. He moved with quiet confidence, his hands resting casually at his sides, but there was an air of danger around him. "Who are you?" The leader growled, narrowing his red eyes. The human didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze shifting to Zia. She felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes seemed to pierce through her, reading her every thought. Was he here to help her, or was he another threat? The leader of the bounty hunters wasn't patient. "Stay out of this, human. This doesn't concern you." The human finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "It does now. You're scaring the girl." The leader sneered. "She's a thief. She's got something that doesn't belong to her." "Doesn't belong to her?" The human raised an eyebrow. "Or doesn't belong to you?" The bounty hunters shifted uncomfortably. The human's calm demeanor was unsettling. The crowd, sensing the tension, began to back away, giving them space. The leader snarled, "You don't know who you're messing with. Walk away while you still can." The human smirked. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you." Before the bounty hunters could react, the human moved. It was so fast that Zia barely saw it. One moment he was standing still, and the next, he had disarmed the leader, twisting his weapon out of his hand and pointing it back at him. The crowd gasped. The other 2 bounty hunters reached for their weapons, but the human's voice stopped them. "Don't." His tone was calm, but there was steel in it. "I can take all 3 of you down before you draw your weapons. Do you really want to try?" The bounty hunters hesitated. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by a human. The leader glared at him, but he didn't move. "This isn't over," the leader growled. He motioned to his men, and they slowly backed away, disappearing into the crowd. The human lowered the weapon and tossed it to the ground. The tension in the air began to fade, but Zia's heart was still racing. She stared at the human, unsure of what to say. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Zia nodded, though she didn't feel okay. "Why? Why did you help me?" The human studied her for a moment. "Let's just say I don't like bullies." Zia wasn't convinced. There was something about him, something dangerous. She couldn't decide if he was her savior or someone to be feared. Before she could say more, He turned and started walking away. "Wait," she called after him. He stopped and looked over his shoulder. "You're not safe here. If you want to live, follow me." Zia hesitated. She didn't know this man. He could be leading her into a trap, but she also knew the bounty hunters would come back. She didn't have a choice. Clutching her bag tightly, she followed him into the shadows, her heart pounding with fear and a flicker of hope. The escape. Zia's lungs burned as she ran through the narrow, twisting alleys of the trading post. Her hood had fallen off, and her glowing green eyes made her an easy target in the dim light. Behind her, the heavy footsteps of bounty hunters echoed, growing louder with every passing second. But she wasn't running alone. The human was ahead of her, moving swiftly and silently, like he knew every corner of this maze-like place. "Keep up," he called over his shoulder, his voice steady and calm, as if he wasn't being chased by ruthless killers. Zia struggled to keep pace. "Why are you helping me?" she gasped, her voice trembling with fear. He didn't look back. "Ask me that when you're not about to die." A loud explosion shook the air, and Zia stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. The bounty hunters were using plasma grenades now. They weren't just trying to catch her. They were ready to destroy anything in their path. The human grabbed her arm, pulling her back to her feet. No time to stop. "Move." Zia had no choice but to follow. He led her through a hidden door that slid shut behind them. The sudden silence was deafening. They were in some kind of underground tunnel, lit by faint blue lights. Zia leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice shaking. The human didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a small device and scanned the tunnel. "Safe for now," he muttered, then turned to face her. His piercing blue eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, and Zia felt that same chill she'd felt when she first saw him. "You still haven't answered my question," Zia said, clutching her bag tightly. "Why did you help me?" The human tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Let's just say I don't like seeing innocent people hunted down." Zia frowned. She didn't believe him. "You're lying." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You're smarter than you look." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnel. Zia's heart leaped into her throat. "They found us." The human held up a hand, signaling her to stay quiet. He pulled out a small device and pressed a button. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden passage. "In here. Now." Zia hesitated. She didn't know this man, and she didn't trust him. But the footsteps were getting closer, and she had no choice. She stepped into the passage, and the wall slid shut behind them. The space was small and dark, barely big enough for the two of them. Zia could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The human pressed his ear to the wall, listening. After a few tense moments, the footsteps faded away. "They're gone," he said quietly. Zia let out a shaky breath. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The human didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but cold. "Someone who knows how to stay alive. And if you want to survive, you'll do exactly what I say." Zia didn't know what frightened her more, the bounty hunters or the man standing in front of her. But one thing was clear: she was trapped with a predator. And she still didn't know if he was on her side. Predator's intentions. The safe house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Zia sat in the corner, clutching her bag like it was her only lifeline. Her glowing green eyes darted to the human, who was pacing the room like a restless predator. His movements were sharp, calculated, like he was always ready to strike. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived, which only made Zia more nervous. The dim light in the room cast long shadows across his face, making his piercing blue eyes look even more intense. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had escaped one trap only to fall into another. "You need to eat," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. He tossed her a small packet of rations, and she barely caught it. I'm not hungry, she replied, her voice wary. You will be, he said, his tone cold and matter-of-fact. Running for your life burns a lot of energy. Zia glared at him. Why do you care? The human stopped pacing and turned to face her. For a moment, his gaze was so sharp that Zia felt like he was reading her soul. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew things she didn't. I don't care, he said flatly, sitting down across from her. I care about staying alive. And if you collapse, you'll slow me down. Zia stiffened. So I'm just a burden to you. Not yet, he replied, leaning back against the wall. But that depends on whether you answer my questions. She hugged her bag tighter, her heart racing. What do you want to know? The crystal, he said, his voice lowering. You have it, don't you? Zia's breath caught in her throat. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet threat that made Zia's skin crawl. I saw how those bounty hunters were after you. They wouldn't chase you across a galaxy for no reason. You're carrying something important, something dangerous. Zia's mind raced. Should she tell him the truth? Could she even trust him? He had saved her life, but he was a stranger, a predator in every sense of the word. And yet, she felt like lying to him would be a mistake. I don't have a choice, she whispered to herself. The human raised an eyebrow. What was that? Zia looked him in the eye, summoning every ounce of courage she had. Yes, I have the crystal, but it's not for you. It belongs to my people. The human didn't react the way she expected. He didn't look surprised or greedy. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Do you even know what it is? It's a relic, she said, her voice trembling. A sacred artifact. That's all you need to know. He chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. A sacred artifact. That's what they told you. He shook his head. That crystal is worth more than most planets. It's not just a relic. It's a weapon. And everyone in the galaxy wants it. Zia's heart sank. She didn't want to believe him. But deep down, she knew he was telling the truth. How do you know all this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The human's eyes darkened. Because I've seen what people are willing to do for it. I fought them. Killed them. And now, they're coming for you. He leaned back, his gaze never leaving hers. So, here's how this works. You tell me everything about that crystal, and I keep you alive. Or you can keep playing games and see how long you last on your own. Zia's hands trembled as she clutched the bag. She didn't trust him, but she didn't have a choice. The predators hunting her were ruthless, and this human might be her only chance to survive. Fine, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I'll tell you everything. But first, you have to promise me something. The human tilted his head, a faint smirk on his lips. And what's that? That you won't take it for yourself, she said, her green eyes blazing with defiance. If you betray me, I'll make sure you regret it. For the first time, the human smirk faded, replaced by a look of genuine curiosity. You've got more fight in you than I thought, he said. Then, after a moment, he nodded. All right, you have my word. But as Zia stared into his cold, calculating eyes, she couldn't help but wonder, how much was a predator's word really worth? Shadows of the past. The air inside the hidden ship was cold, almost sterile. Zia stepped cautiously onto the metallic floor, her footsteps echoing in the dimly lit corridor. She had never been on a human ship before, and something about it felt unsettling. It wasn't just the silence, it was the trophies. Mounted on the walls were alien weapons, intricate carvings, and pieces of armor, each more unusual than the last. Some were cracked and battle-worn, while others gleamed like they had been polished just yesterday. To Zia, it wasn't a collection. It was a warning. What is this place? She whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the ship's systems. The human, John, walked ahead without looking back. It's a tool, he said simply. Like me. Zaya froze, staring at his back. There was something about the way he said it, detached, almost robotic, that sent a shiver down her spine. She tightened her grip on her bag. A tool for what? He stopped in front of a large panel and pressed a series of buttons. Lights flickered on, illuminating the rest of the room. More trophies lined the walls, but these weren't just artifacts. Some were scared helmets, others were fragments of weapons with strange, glowing symbols carved into them. But what caught Zia's attention most were the holographic images displayed in the corner. Faces of alien creatures, some of them crossed out in red. Targets, she realized aloud, her voice trembling. John turned to face her, his piercing blue eyes unreadable. "You're quick. I like that. What is this, some kind of trophy room?" she asked, her tone sharp with disbelief. "Are these all the people you've killed?" John's expression didn't change. Not all, just the ones that mattered. Zaya felt a lump rise in her throat. She took a step back, bumping into the cold metal wall behind her. "You're a hunter," she whispered. "A predator." "I was," John said, his tone calm but firm. "Not anymore." Zia couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You expect me to trust you?" After seeing all this, John leaned against the console, folding his arms. "What you see here are the tools of my past, not my future. If I'd wanted the crystal or you dead, I would have done it already." Zia didn't know if that was supposed to reassure her or terrify her more. Her eyes darted back to the holographic images. "Why did you stop?" For the first time, something flickered in John's expression, something that almost looked like regret. "I had a choice," he said quietly. "Keep hunting and lose what little humanity I had left, or walk away." "And what did you choose?" Zia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John's gaze darkened. "You tell me." Zia didn't respond. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her logic told her she wouldn't get far. This man, this predator, had saved her life. But the question that haunted her now was why. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "What do you really want?" John pushed himself off the console and walked toward her, stopping just a few steps away. "The bounty hunters chasing you aren't ordinary thugs. They're part of something bigger, something worse. I've seen what they're capable of. I've fought them before. And now they're after you." "Why?" Zaya asked, clutching her bag protectively. "Because of the crystal," John said. "It's more than just a relic, isn't it?" Zia hesitated, torn between telling him the truth and keeping her secret. Finally, she nodded. It's the key to my people's survival." John studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Then let me give you a piece of advice. If you want to survive, you'll need to stop thinking like prey." "What's that supposed to mean?" Zia demanded. "It means," John said, stepping closer, "the galaxy isn't kind to the weak. If you want to protect that crystal, your people, or yourself, you need to start making hard choices. And you need to decide whether you can trust me." Zia stared at him, her mind racing. Could she trust him? She didn't know. But one thing was certain. She couldn't survive on her own. Not against the predators chasing her. She took a deep breath and met his gaze. "Fine," she said. "I'll trust you, for now. But if you betray me, you'll regret it." John interrupted, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I hear that a lot." Zia's green eyes narrowed. "I mean it." For a moment, they stared at each other, predator and prey. Then John turned away, heading deeper into the ship. "Get some rest," he said over his shoulder. "We leave at dawn. The real hunt begins tomorrow." Zaya stayed where she was, her heart pounding. She didn't know what terrified her more, the bounty hunters chasing her, or the man who had just offered to protect her. A predator unleashed. The ship's alarm blared, a shrill warning that echoed through every corridor. Zia clutched the edge of the console, her hands trembling. Outside the window, the bounty hunters' sleek black ships were closing in, their weapons glowing with deadly intent. "They found us," she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. John stood at the center of the room, eerily calm as chaos unfolded around him. His piercing blue eyes tracked the enemy ships like a hawk watching its prey. He didn't move, didn't flinch, even as a plasma blast rocked the ship and sent sparks flying from the control panels. "Get to the cargo bay," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. Zia hesitated. "But now," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Zia stumbled out of the room, her heart racing. As she ran, the ship shook violently, the sound of explosions growing louder. She reached the cargo bay and crouched behind a stack of crates, hugging her bag tightly. Her mind raced with questions. Why wasn't John panicking? Did he have a plan? Or was this the end? The ship jolted again, throwing her to the floor. She gasped and scrambled back to her feet, her eyes darting toward the door. It slid open with a hiss, and John stepped in, a large weapon slung over his shoulder. His expression was cold, focused, and completely devoid of fear. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Shouldn't you be flying the ship?" "They're boarding," he said simply, striding past her. Zia's heart stopped. "What? You mean they're coming inside?" John didn't answer. He walked to the center of the bay, setting down his weapon with precise movements. Then he pulled a long blade from his belt, the metal gleaming in the dim light. "What are you doing?" Zia asked, her voice trembling. "We should run." John finally looked at her, his eyes like ice. "They think they're predators," he said quietly. "I'm going to remind them what a real one looks like." Before Zia could respond, the cargo bay doors were blasted open. Smoke filled the room, and shadowy figures stepped through, their weapons raised. The bounty hunters were here. "Spread out," one of them barked. "Find the girl." Zia froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She crouched lower behind the crates, holding her breath. But John didn't hide. He stepped forward, his blade in hand, and spoke in a voice that sent chills down her spine. "Looking for me?" The bounty hunters turned toward him, their weapons trained on his chest. The leader sneered. "You think you can take us on by yourself, human? You've got no backup. No chance." John tilted his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "You talk too much." And then he moved. It happened so fast that Zia could barely follow. One moment, John was standing still. The next, he was a blur of motion. He closed the distance between himself and the nearest hunter in seconds, his blade slicing through the air. The hunter fell with a grunt, his weapon clattering to the floor. The others opened fire, but John was already moving, weaving through their shots with terrifying precision. He fought like a predator unleashed, his movements calculated and deadly. Every swing of his blade found its mark. Every step brought him closer to his next target. Zia watched in stunned silence, her fear mingling with awe. This wasn't the calm, composed man she had been traveling with. This was something else, something far more dangerous. He wasn't just fighting, he was hunting. The last hunter standing dropped his weapon and tried to run, but John caught him before he reached the door. He slammed the hunter against the wall, his blade pressed against the alien's throat. "Tell your boss," John said, his voice low and menacing. "If he comes after her again, I'll finish what I started." The hunter nodded frantically, his face pale. John let him go, and the alien stumbled out of the room, disappearing into the smoke. For a long moment, the only sound in the cargo bay was John's heavy breathing. His blade dripped with blood, the light reflecting off its edge. He turned to Zia, his expression unreadable. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now. Zia shook her head, unable to find her voice. She had never seen anything like that before. John wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature, a predator. And for the first time, she realized just how dangerous he truly was. The alien truth. The silence after the battle was suffocating. The air in the ship reeked of smoke and scorched metal, but it was the tension between Zia and John that weighed the heaviest. Zia sat against the wall of the cargo bay, her glowing green eyes wide, as she watched John clean his bloody blade with mechanical precision. His movements were calm, almost detached, like he hadn't just torn through a group of bounty hunters with the ferocity of a beast. "You're not human," Zia finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. John paused, his eyes flicking to her. "Last time I checked, I was," he replied, his tone flat. Zia shook her head, her hands gripping the bag that held the crystal. "No human fights like that. No human kills like that." He didn't answer. Instead, he sheathed the blade and leaned back against the wall, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "What do you think I am, then?" "A predator," she said, her voice trembling. "You move like them. You think like them. But you pretend to be something else." John's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're not wrong," he admitted, his tone colder now. "But pretending? No. I've been many things, Zia. A soldier, a mercenary, a hunter. But underneath all of that, I'm still human. Just not the kind you're used to." Zia didn't know what terrified her more, his words or the way he said them, like he was speaking the universal truth she could never understand. She looked down at her bag, clutching it tighter. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" John didn't answer right away. He stood and began pacing the room, his gaze distant. "It's not about you," he said finally. "It's about what you're carrying." "The crystal?" Zia asked, her heart sinking. He nodded, stopping to face her. "Do you even know what it is? What it can do?" It's a relic," Zia said, her voice faltering. "An artifact from my homeworld. It's sacred." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's more than sacred. It's dangerous." Zia's eyes widened. "Dangerous? How?" John walked to the console and tapped a few buttons. A hologram of the crystal appeared, spinning slowly in the air. Its glowing, jagged edges pulsed with energy, casting an eerie light across the room. "That crystal isn't just a relic," John said, his voice low and serious. "It's a power source, one strong enough to destroy planets or save them. And right now, every warlord, mercenary, and bounty hunter in the galaxy knows you have it." Zia's breath caught in her throat. "Destroy planets," she whispered. "That can't be true. It's just a symbol of hope for my people." John's gaze softened for the briefest moment. "Maybe it is, but symbols like that come with a price. People will kill for it. They already have." Zia's mind raced, the weight of his words crashing down on her. She had always known the crystal was valuable, but she had never imagined it could be this dangerous. "If it's so powerful, why haven't you taken it from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. John stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Because I don't want it. I've seen what power like that does to people. It's a curse as much as it's a weapon. And I'm not here to take it. I'm here to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Zia stared at him, her fear slowly giving way to confusion. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." For a moment, John's icy exterior cracked. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because I've seen this before," he said quietly. "Years ago, I failed to protect someone from people like the ones chasing you. I won't let that happen again." Zia's heart ached at the pain in his voice, but she still didn't trust him completely. "So what now?" she asked. "You just protect me until—" "What?" "I die, and you get your redemption." John's gaze snapped back to hers, hard and unyielding. "No, I protect you because it's the right thing to do. But don't mistake my intentions for weakness. If you think for a second that crystal is more important than your life, you're wrong. You're the key to all of this, Zia. You're more important than you realize." Zia's hand shook as she clutched the bag. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her responsibility. not just to her people, but to the galaxy. And for the first time, she began to see John not just as a predator, but as a man haunted by his own failures, trying to make things right. The ship jolted suddenly, and an alarm blared to life. John's expression hardened as he grabbed his weapon. "They found us again," he said. "We don't have much time. Make a choice, Zia. Run and hide, or stand and fight." Zia looked into his piercing blue eyes, her fear melting into determination. "I'm tired of running," she said, standing tall. "Let's fight." John nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Good. It's about time." The final hunt. The final beacon of the crystal lit up, casting a brilliant blue glow across the desolate canyon. It pulsed with energy, its hum growing louder with each passing second. Zia stared at it, her heart pounding, knowing what it meant. They were coming. "They'll be here any second," John said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. He was crouched behind a jagged rock, assembling a long, sleek rifle with precision that bordered on robotic. Every movement was calm, deliberate, like he had done this 1,000 times before. Zia stood a few steps behind him, clutching the bag that held the crystal. Her hands trembled, but her resolve was firm. "We don't have to do this," she said, her voice cracking. "We can still run." John didn't even look at her. "Running won't work anymore," he said. "You know that." She wanted to argue, to find another way, but deep down she knew he was right. The bounty hunters wouldn't stop. They had followed them across galaxies, through spaceports and battlefields, and now they were here, on this barren, unforgiving planet where there was nowhere left to hide. "Why are you so calm?" Zia demanded, her fear boiling over into frustration. "They'll kill us both." John finally turned to her, his piercing blue eyes colder than she had ever seen. "Because this is what I do," he said simply. "I don't run. I hunt." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Zia swallowed hard, her gaze darting to the horizon. In the distance, dark shapes appeared, ships, sleek and deadly, descending like vultures. The bounty hunters were here. "They outnumber us," Zia said, panic creeping into her voice. "There's no way we can win." John smirked faintly, his hands tightening on the rifle. "Numbers don't matter," he said. "Not to me." He stood and walked to a nearby console, pressing a series of buttons. The canyon lit up with hidden traps, plasma mines embedded in the ground, auto turrets concealed in the cliffs, and a shimmering energy shield that flickered to life around their position. Zia's jaw dropped. You planned all of this." John glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Of course I did. You think I'd walk into a fight without a plan?" The ships landed, and figures began to emerge, hulking, armored bounty hunters armed with deadly weapons. Their leader, the scared alien Zia had first encountered on the trading post, stepped forward. His red eyes glowed with fury as he spotted her. "Give us the crystal," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the canyon. "And maybe we'll let you live." John stepped in front of Zia, raising his rifle. "Come and take it," he called back, his tone mocking. The leader snarled and signaled his men forward. They charged, weapons blazing, and all hell broke loose. The traps activated in perfect sequence. Plasma mines exploded, throwing hunters into the air. The auto turrets roared to life, picking off enemies with deadly accuracy. But the bounty hunters kept coming, their sheer numbers overwhelming the defenses. John moved like a shadow, firing precise shots that took down enemies with chilling efficiency. Zia watched in awe and terror as he fought. He wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature, a predator unleashed. But even he couldn't hold them off forever. "Zia," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The crystal. Use it." She froze, clutching the bag tighter. "I don't know how," she cried. "Yes, you do," he yelled. "It's part of you. Trust yourself." Zia's mind raced. The crystal pulsed in her hands, its light growing brighter, almost blinding. She could feel its energy, raw and powerful, coursing through her. She closed her eyes and let it guide her. The ground trembled as the crystal's energy surged outward, forming a protective barrier around them. The bounty hunters' weapons fizzled and died, their ships crashing to the ground as the crystal's power overwhelmed them. The leader roared in defiance, but even he couldn't stand against it. One by one, the hunters fell. When the light faded, the canyon was silent. Zia opened her eyes, her body trembling from the effort. The crystal's glow dimmed, but it still pulsed faintly in her hands. John approached her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen before: pride. "You did it," he said quietly. Zia shook her head. "No, we did." John smiled faintly and nodded. "Fair enough." As they stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle, Zia realized something. She wasn't just running anymore. She wasn't just surviving. She was fighting. For her people, for her future, and for herself. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the question. John looked out at the horizon, his gaze distant. "Now," he said, "we make sure this crystal never falls into the wrong hands again." Zia nodded, determination burning in her chest. Together, they turned toward the ship, ready to face whatever came next.